Welcome to Redeemers The Cut. My name is Leah Martinez.
And my name is Brian Kane.
And today,
how you doing? My name is Billy Glosson.
We have Billy Glosson. And Billy, why don't you go ahead and share a little bit with who you are, where you're from, what you're about?
Sure. So my name is Billy Glosson, and I am the lead pastor of Coram Deo Church in Morganton, North Carolina. I grew up here in Morganton, lived in Missouri for a number of years, went out there, went to school, and got connected with a church that's a part of the same church planting network that both Redeemer and Coram Deo is a part of, Acts 29, and served there for a number of years. Was stirred and compelled to come back home and to plant a new gospel-centered church in the heart of Burke County, North Carolina, where I'm at in Morganton. And so we planted Coram Deo Church, which Coram Deo is a Latin phrase that means before the face of God or in the presence of God. And we named the church that intentionally, right? So maybe you're thinking, hey, if you know anything about this area that we're in kind of a more rural area that is growing and developing, but it's definitely not where you would expect to find a church with a Latin name. But we intentionally chose this name for two reasons. One, it ties us into a historic confessional faith. This is a phrase that really stuck out in the Reformation. But two, to push against this idea that Sunday morning is for Jesus and everything else is for me, that we live these kind of fragmented lives, but rather that the whole of who we are, everything that we do is to be lived in God's presence before his face. And so that's what we've been about here in Morganton, North Carolina, making much of Jesus, living the whole of our lives in his presence. And so it's been a blast. It's been a challenge. We launched March of 2020, but God's been faithful. And so, yeah, that's a little bit about me and our church in just kind of a very, very small nutshell.
Yeah, and I feel like that just kind of feeds right into what you spoke about at Redeemer, because Billy came and spoke this past Sunday here at Redeemer Space in Johnson City about being a servant. I don't know, everything you were saying, I was like, man, that just is such a great segue into our conversation. So we take this time to kind of break down the sermon, have a conversation, and then also kind of talk about some practicality to living out what we've heard from Sunday morning. So, Billy, I know you do this every week at your all's church at Coram Deo.
We do, yes, we do.
So we can do a little shout out to Billy's podcast.
We do a podcast called The Follow Up, and it's basically a weekly look back to Sunday.
Yeah, that's great. So y'all should check that out. But Billy, was there some particular things you want to start us off with on what you maybe weren't able to get to on Sunday, or maybe some things that you mentioned but maybe weren't able to go really deep with?
Yeah, there actually is something that comes right to my mind. And this past Sunday at Redeemer, you guys learned a new song called Abide. And what was so unique about that song is that it repeats over and over again, I depend on you. And in the sermon, I just kind of casually mentioned that and said that we're allergic to dependence. And so one of the things, the reason that comes to mind is the task, the call of Mark chapter 10, this idea that we're called to serve as we follow in the way of Jesus, is really hard. Like, I hope no one heard the sermon and was like, oh yeah, totally got it, easy. Because again, the call is challenging. The call is hard, right? It's difficult. We need Jesus. Yeah. And that's really the whole point, is that we depend on him. Right. If we're going to live this way, if we're going to walk in the way of Jesus, if we're going to be those who understand that there will be suffering, if we're going to understand that hey, this is going to be humble service, and that we're going to need to be those who serve everyone. The only way we're going to do that is if we walk dependent on Jesus, on the Holy Spirit at work in us to conform us to the image of Christ, to give us the ability to love and serve others. And so that's definitely something that comes to the forefront of my mind. That's like, man, if I could talk about anything, and grind an axe for a while, it would be that for sure.
Yeah. It's really funny because being 3 weeks into this position and building a team, I was having breakfast this morning with someone who we were talking about youth ministry and what it looks like to serve. And I was explaining to him how when I became a Christian very, very early on in my walk with Jesus, junior, senior year of high school, and I learned about what discipleship was and what service was. For me, they were like these two separate boxes of I am being discipled or doing discipleship, and I'm
Yeah.
being served and doing service. And so for me, and your sermon did a really, really good job. It was really funny whenever you said, I remember you saying that statement, being allergic to dependency, and someone behind me was like, yes. And I was like, that's awesome. Like that's one of the snapshots that I too got from your sermon. And just talking this morning with the guy about like, man, these two things go together. So you can't have discipleship without service. You can't have service without discipleship. And so often we think of, and I think it's because, this might be a rabbit trail, but I think it's because in the West, we're such an intellectually based people in terms of like, belief, thought, everything is in our minds. And, it's not the whole of us.
Yes.
So we can, in some ways, kind of put things in different boxes of like, well, discipleship is what I'm taught and what I know, and service is what I do. And, I have to do with my hands and feet, and discipleship has to do with my brain and my heart. And it's like, no, these things come together. Like following Jesus and living like Jesus has to do with the whole self.
Yeah.
So it's that whenever you made that statement, I could feel everyone in the room like, oh yeah, like that's me.
Yeah.
Like I am independent.
Ryan,
really
we are all about the rabbit trails.
Yeah.
Here at the Cut. All about the rabbit trails.
Man, the rabbit trails become those paths that are most traveled in my mind. So yeah, really, really good.
No, I think you bring up a good point, that we separate things that should not be separated. And then in doing that, we make it so much harder on ourselves, when really actually, because they're married together, because it is the same thing, when we're like living in the Spirit and walking in that, it's not something I have to think about of, am I serving someone? It's just coming out a little bit more than, I have to make sure I'm checking these boxes. How many hours a week am I spending serving people, instead of like, no, part of my discipleship to Jesus is being open to my family and my community all the time. There is no separation. Right. It's all the time. And so service just naturally comes out a little bit more.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's an overflow of all of who we are. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Very, very good.
Yeah. It's that tension point that we always talk about in the church of like faith and works, right? We understand that like we're saved not by all of our doing, right? You're not saved because you're a great servant. You're saved because Christ was. And that's the whole point, right? That we come back to over and over again, is that we lean on, we trust in, we follow Jesus. And then the overflow, right, is that a faith that works.
Exactly.
And so that's so huge. And it's so challenging, right? To want to understand like, okay, if I like follow Christ and trust in Jesus, then the natural overflow is going to be what Galatians tells us, right? It's going to be the fruits of the Spirit.
Yep.
But if it's this, I've got to do enough.
Right.
I've got to try harder. So like, I'll just say this. If you were there on Sunday, or if you listened and you're thinking from that sermon, okay, so the solution then is I've just got to do more, then you missed it, right? Like that's not it. I promise you, because you can't do enough. And that's the call again, that we come to the feet of Jesus.
Yep.
So I wanted to mention this to you guys. I was walking around Redeemer and love the space. It's really cool. Different for sure. I showed a clip of the Sunday service to my team, and they got a good chuckle of me like spinning around like a goober.
Slowly spinning. Yes. Yeah,
you did that so systematically.
Yes,
I was really impressed.
I immediately got up and was just like doing one of, looking around and stuff, because I was like, this is different, but it's also beautiful. But one of the things too that I noticed was, I don't know if you guys call it your Connect table or your whatever it is, the table where you've got like different resources and like your Connect cards, and you've got the how to be part of the Redeemer family. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah. Connect table.
Billy, that is I'm nervous to bring any attention to that. Such a work in progress.
Hey, that's
okay. Hey, no. Here's the thing. Regardless of like whether it's a work in progress or not, there's a beautiful part of like that language of like what it looks like to be a part of the family. But tucked away on that table were a few books that I think were just like, hey, here's some excess that we have, and in that. So I hope for those of you who don't have this book already that you'll go and snag a copy of it. It's a book called Enjoy Your Prayer Life by Michael Reeves. You guys know that book? Have you ever read it?
I have.
Really good.
I put it there on purpose.
Is he the same guy that wrote Enjoying the Trinity?
Delighting in the Trinity.
Same guy. Okay. Yeah. I've never read.
Michael Reeves,
First.
Michael Reeves has this really unique gift of being able to take massive theological concepts and put them in like a very like easy, accessible resource. And so he's got stuff on the fear of God. He's got stuff on the Trinity. But this book that I'm talking about is called Enjoy Your Prayer Life. And what's great about it, man, there's so many great books on prayer. There's Paul Miller's A Praying Life, which is, a classic, beautiful book. But this, just listen to this snippet, this quote. This is what Reeves says in his book. He says, if God was a single independent person, independence would be the godly thing. That would be how to be like him. But because the Son always depends on the Father, dependence is the nature of Christian godliness. Being a Christian is first and foremost all about receiving, asking, and depending. It's when you don't feel needy, and so when you don't pray much, that you lose your grip on reality and think or act in an unchristian manner. In fact, as you grow as a Christian, you should feel not more self-sufficient, but ever more needy. Prayer then is enjoying the care of a powerful Father instead of being left to a frightening loneliness where everything is all down to you.
Yeah.
Man, that's so helpful because, again, if we look at the challenge, the call of Jesus, who looks at James and John, right, when they make this ridiculous request, and then he says that, hey, if you want to be the servant, be the servant of all. If you want to be the greatest in the kingdom, be the servant of all. And we hear that, and immediately, if maybe you're not like this, but if you're like me, you hear that and you think, wow, that's really hard. That's a huge task. How do I do that?
Yeah.
And again, that's where we get to that last line, that if it's all down to me, if the chips are on Billy, then I'm left to a terrifying, frightening loneliness. But if it's on Jesus, y'all.
Yeah, and it's light, right? It's not a heavy weight. It's light. I was thinking too, as you were saying that, Billy, that we do this, we're talking about this because we trust that as believers, as Christians, the Spirit is making us more like Christ. And so I think your sermon, in my mind, is like us getting out of our own way. Because, whether you want to call it like empire, Rome, whatever you want to call America, culture over here, is saying like, this is what success looks like. This is what it looks like to be human. And the way of Christ, the kingdom of God, is saying something different. And so as believers, what does it look like to live in this world, to be in this space, but to not operate out of who's going to serve me? How am I being taken care of? Who's looking at me? Am I being appreciated and praised? But rather following the way of Jesus and trusting that I am going to be taken care of, right? Like God is taking care of his people since the beginning. He's going to take care of me. And so walking in that way of humility, because Christ became a servant to all, right? And he was faithful to the point of death. And so for me to not look at anyone and say, just like you said on Sunday, I'm not better than anyone here. Like true humility, someone said this quote, I wish I could remember who it was. Somebody said, true humility is not being any more or any less than who you are in Christ.
Yeah.
And we see and when you examine like the whole biblical story, you see dependence as like the way of God. Like you see in the garden, like Adam and Eve fell because of their independence.
Right.
You see
Right.
like the story of Israel. Israel failed because of their lack of dependence. You step into like the historical books and in like the book of Joshua starts, like we love Joshua 1:9 of like be strong and courageous, but we don't see that right before that God is saying, I've promised you this land.
Yeah.
Like this is yours. Therefore be strong and courageous. So like this notion of dependency is seen throughout the entire biblical story. And yet how often do we forget the biblical story? How
Right.
often are we, those who want to sit at the right and the left, forgetting that it is about the one who is sitting in the middle, that it's all about. So yeah, that's so good. So good.
It's really good. Another resource. Sorry, I think that's what pops in my head sometimes.
No, it's
but there's
great.
a Another really small book, right? So if you're like, I'm not a huge reader, another really, really small book is a book by Tim Keller called The Freedom of Self-Forgetfulness.
So, it's really funny, Billy, that same
that?
basket that you were talking about
Yeah.
with the Enjoy Your Prayer Life, that book was in there too, but it's all sold out. So I've got it on order, but those were the 3 books in there.
Good. I'm glad. I'm just vibing with that basket.
There you go.
So what's so great about it is he says that gospel humility is not thinking more of myself or thinking less of myself. It is thinking of myself less.
Yeah.
That was C.S. Lewis.
Yeah.
Oh, C.S. Lewis. Tim Keller's quoting C.S.
Yeah,
Lewis.
yeah.
And the kind of flow out from that he says that I think is so great is he says gospel humility is not needing to think about myself, not needing to connect things with myself. It's an end to thoughts such as, I'm in this room with these people. Does that make me look good?
Mm-hmm.
I love that book and the push and the emphasis towards humility, because humility is not something that we can just muster up on our own, right?
No, absolutely not.
It's so challenging. And that's part of the reason why in the middle of the sermon, we kind of paused from our time in Mark and we went over to Philippians 2,
Right.
because we see this kind of grand exposition on the humility of Christ.
Right.
And it sets in perspective for us what true humility is. So I guess the question I would ask you guys is, how do we pursue humility, right? So I'm listening to the cut. It's a Thursday.
Yeah.
I'm at work.
Yeah.
I'm kind of taking a break, and I'm like struggling because I feel like I make everything about myself. How in the world do I get to a place where I walk in humility?
Yeah.
I think, and what I love about this series is you are connecting, Billy, to things that, my first week here, 2 weeks ago, we were talking about pride manifesting in the more obvious thing of boasting, right? Or self-pity. Like both are extensions of pride. So I would start, and this is something that I am not good at. So this is good that you bring this up because it's something for me to reflect on. But I think it is just that. It's reflecting on what are areas of my own life, like taking time, right? We don't take time, but taking time during a lunch break, taking time during a coffee break, and really like assessing like what are areas of my own life that I'm leaning towards independence. Like what are moments throughout the day at work, whenever I get home and have to watch my kids, or when I'm with my friends, or when I'm with a sports team, thinking of specifically a student context, like what are areas where I'm seeing myself gravitate to independence of, I need to do it. If I don't do it, it's not done correctly. Or even like the other side of things, the weight of, if I do it and it fails, like everyone is looking at me and I'm kind of basking in this kind of guilt complex. So I think first is evaluating, right? Like being one who is assessing and evaluating and making space to think through what are areas that I'm leaning into me more than I'm leaning into who the person and work of Jesus is and says about me.
Awareness.
Yes,
awareness. And I would say along with the awareness piece is asking someone, a trusted friend, partner, to walk alongside you and say, hey, listen, I'm inviting you into this with me to help point things out, because that's why we need community, right? Because I can maybe see a little bit of a hazy mirror in front of me and catch some things, but you see things better, different than I do. So inviting someone into that with you too, at that awareness piece, because I think sometimes we can still only have a hazy view of awareness if it's just us evaluating ourselves.
Yes, absolutely. And that shows, that's the community aspect of things, right? Like of another Western tendency is kind of the individualism that we love partaking in, but being reminded even today in our staff meeting about the Great Commission, the Great co-mission with one another, right? So I think, evaluate. I talked for like 3 minutes, and what I love about Leah is she said awareness. It's like, yes, I could have just said,
oh gosh,
awareness,
no.
right? Like so she sums things up very, very well, and I'm very thankful for that.
Well, anybody that thinks that that's true can listen to the first 5 minutes of this podcast when that is not true.
But yes, awareness.
Yeah, and I was going to say practice, because Billy, just like you said 2 seconds ago, if we're waiting for humility to be birthed in us, we're going to be waiting a long time. So practice, right? Like think through, okay, what is a really practical thing that I can do to serve the people around me, right? It doesn't have to be this grand, glorious thing, but man, if I fill up the water at work, or if I take out somebody's trash, or if I do these little things, and it's not for thanks, it's not so that they notice and say, Brian, thank you so much for doing that. I mean, it's great if they say that, but if they don't, I'm not going to build up resentment. I'm doing it because I want to make their life better, and for them to see Jesus, right, at the end of the day, for all of that to point towards, I'm serving you because I love Jesus and he served me, and so who am I to think that I'm better than him? And I want to serve the people around me. So I would say practice, because that's the only way we're going to get better at things.
Yeah. If you're waiting to feel something,
right,
to do something, like if you're waiting to like feel a love for someone you hate to serve them, you will be waiting for the entirety of your life. Like the way of Jesus is that while we were sinners, Christ died for us, right? Yep. Not when we cleaned ourselves up, which goes back, Billy, to your example, the example that you gave about, things being really, really difficult in the midst of COVID. And then there's the guy who comes to your office who I think you used the phrase he hated Jesus. And then said, the ways that you served me, the things that you and these other men in my life did, it was those things that allowed me to see that there is someone so much greater, and someone, and if you guys, as flawed as you all are showing these things, how much greater is the one who is not in any way flawed and able to love me. So
Yeah, man. And you guys are nailing it, because I think a big part of this that's so key is this community piece.
Yeah.
If we try to live our lives as a lone wolf, like, it's just me and Jesus. So you guys aren't a part of Coram Deo, so you don't hear this all the time. But a couple of things I always say is, everyone always says it's a personal relationship with Jesus. A toothbrush is personal, right? Yes. Like there is a part and a component that is like intimate and personal. I'm not denying that, but I'm saying that like there is an aspect to our faith that we have to acknowledge that is shared.
Yes.
That is found beautifully in community. The second thing is just that like a lone wolf is a dead wolf.
Yep.
You don't see that, right? We just have to understand that it's not just me and Jesus. It's not just fighting to kind of do things on my own, right? That goes against it. You guys have it in your language that you can't one another yourself. I love that. I think that's so helpful. So I guess what I would add to what you guys are saying is you need to preach the gospel to yourself, but that's really hard to do when you don't have others who are preaching the gospel to you as well.
Yeah,
right?
That's right.
So Martin Lloyd-Jones says the trouble with Christians is they listen to themselves when they should talk to themselves. So good, right?
So good.
Because we get in that trap of like this almost insanity cycle that we go through of like, man, I talked so much at that last like hangout. I just made everything about me. I really wish I would have done that. I wish I would have like built other people up, and then I'm the worst. And we go low, 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 but we don't go low in such a way where we're making much of Jesus. We're still making much of ourselves.
Yeah.
And so what does it look like to deny ourselves and make much of Jesus? And that is, again, a place where we have to come back to the scriptures and say, Lord, how do I make much of you in my conversations? What do I see in the example of Jesus, in the way that he's gentle and firm, that he's welcoming, that he's gracious, that he's kind? And then also we allow voices in community to speak to us, right? To talk back to us and tell us like, hey man, here's where I see God growing you. Here's where I feel like you could be challenged a little bit to come to deeper understandings of who Jesus is and what he's done. And that's so rich and so beautiful and so helpful.
Yeah. Yeah.
I've caught myself reveling in my ability to be hyper aware of my flaws. And I can break that down a little bit. Like what you just said, going low and saying, man, I didn't, I built myself up. I didn't, build relationships with those on the fringes. I caught myself being, and then there's a part of me after going through that process where I say, I'm pretty aware. I'm pretty, I'm pretty into it, but when you don't have the piece of like, oh man, like Christ has renewed me. And within that, like I could just get caught up in praising myself for what I didn't do well, as opposed to the other end where you could praise yourself for the things you do well. It's like you're caught up in this trap. So like as you were talking, Billy, it's like, oh man, I know moments in my life where I'm like, oh man, I am caught up in this. Like both of them, kind of like self-pity and boast. I'm reveling in me and in my awareness and not taking it a step further and realizing that, man, how good is Jesus that he reveals these things to me and that I can be renewed in the gospel. And that's all that to say, that's why we need other people in our lives, because oftentimes we can not take it a step further and say, how good is Jesus that he's revealed these things? I'm his child. I'm loved. I'm not defined by, the things I do well or even the things that I don't do well, but I'm defined in who he says I am. But that's not something that we can, all the time go on we need one another for that. So sorry, that was kind of a tangent too, but it just makes me think like, man,
self-awareness is great until it gets in our way.
Right.
Like we make much of it. And again, it's not about how aware of ourselves are we, but how aware of Christ are we? And so just the way you landed the plane there, talking about that who we are, who Christ has made us to be, who we're being conformed in the image of, and who we will one day behold in glory. That's where we have to come back to over and over and rehearse those truths. That's why we do the same things every Sunday, right? That's why we sing to each other. That's why we hear the word. That's why we partake of the elements, because we're rehearsing the truths of the gospel over and over to forgetful hearts. And we need that. We need it. We need it.
Yeah. I just had another thought. So I know everyone watching this or listening to this cannot see these really gorgeous pictures that are behind Brian's head, but there's these really beautiful pictures that our friend Kristen Colson painted a really long time ago. And as we've been kind of talking around faith and works, and Brian, you had mentioned earlier, sometimes we separate things unnecessarily. And I'm just thinking like, man, a tree produces fruit, loses its leaves, grows new ones, and it's not trying to do that, right? It's just doing what the season is calling for. And I'm thinking like with faith and works is not this like thing separate from faith, like you were talking about earlier, this division, but it's just the fruit that just comes out of abiding with Christ. And so just encouragement, Billy, you had said this earlier, like if you're thinking like, how can I make myself busier? How can I be serving others better? I mean, those to a certain extent are good things to be thinking about, but at the same time, this isn't something that we make happen in our own hearts and our own lives, but it's the gift of the Spirit. So you don't need to be thinking like, how can I appear to be like I'm producing the fruit of the Spirit, but rather by being with Jesus and being with people that are pointing me to Jesus, I trust that the Spirit is going to produce these things in me.
Yeah.
And we need one another to say, I see those things in you, right?
Yeah.
Going back to the community piece, because we can wallow in one or the other of I'm not good enough or I am better than. And whenever we have people in our lives who humbly bring us back to this is how God has designed you and these are the gifts that he's given you, right? Like that brings us where we need to be.
One of the church fathers had this thing, and I can't remember which one it is. Maybe I'll look it up. And there's a lot of them. But on one side, it says, you're made from dust, and to dust you'll return. Mm-hmm. So when we're feeling like, man, I'm doing it. I'm doing it. You are dust, and to dust you'll return. And then the other side says, and you are the beloved of Christ. Mm-hmm. And so holding those things together, like we are so temporal, but we are beloved, and holding those things kind of at the same time.
Mm-hmm. That's really, really good.
That's really good. I think it's to make it way more, my student ministry mind goes to, I think it's Matt Chandler who says that no one walks with a limp in the kingdom of heaven and no one walks with a swagger. Something like that, like there's these two. So that's the 21st century.
There you go.
Translation of the church fathers. No one walks with a limp, but no one walks
yes, I like
with
it.
a swagger.
I like it.
Really good.
Billy, your sermon on Sunday, I was sitting there and I was like, yes. This is so good. I was just very encouraged by your message and the seeds that it's planted with the people sitting there, with the people listening, but just really excited for the things that are going to come from the words that God put on your heart. So
And
I really appreciate you.
And I'll say this too, Billy. No one really knows this, but where I came from, Lenore, North Carolina, is about 15 minutes from where Billy's church is in Morganton. Yep. So just to know, like, you know, it was really, really difficult to leave and leaving behind awesome relationships, awesome people, to start afresh. But to know, like, as I'm leaving, there are people not only at my church, but there are other people in the area who are doing such good gospel-centered ministry is like, I feel like, you know, it's been so good the past several weeks here, but the Lord is kind of balming my heart all the more to know that, like, there are people like you, man, and the deacons and elders and you know, people you serve with who are doing such good work in an area that means a lot to you, and I know means a lot to me, and I know means even more to you since you grew up there and spent a lot of time there. So yeah, thank you for your words here, and press on, man, press on.
Yeah. We're hugely grateful for Redeemer down the mountain. We love you guys. We're thankful for all you guys are doing in Tennessee, and we want to continue to do gospel work down here in the foothills. So we're grateful for you guys.
So good. Well, Billy, thank you for your time. And guys, if you didn't listen to Billy's message on Sunday, you can find that. We'll link that in the show notes. And and then also check out Coram Deo. Check out their podcast. Can you remind us the name one more time, Billy?
So you can just head over to our website, quorumdeonc.com, but the name of the podcast is The Follow-Up. But anywhere you look for it, we throw all of ours on the same feed. We don't do, you know, the cool, like, separate feeds like you guys. We just have it all in one. So you get our sermon, and then boom, right after that, you get the follow-up. So.
Awesome. Well, Billy, thank you. Thank you so much. Cheers.
Thanks, bro.
Absolutely. Thank you, guys. Take care.